This is an extended video on quotations about Edward Rochester. I had forgotten what an interesting and complex character Rochester actually is. So whilst he has quite a lot of the typical traits of an English gentleman of the time period, the way he's travelled, his house, how he entertains and how he enjoys spending money, he's also eccentric and unconventional. We need to look at how he is deceitful in a number of places in the text, and he's also got a fairly unpredictable nature too. Whilst he has got a number of elements of your typical Byronic hero, this is also a role that Bronte subverts within him as well. I found it particularly interesting that one of the first mentions of him before we've even met him is his seasickness that Adela tells Jane about. So he's presented as someone who obviously can't help being seasick, but that's not him sort of being a hero at the front of the boat. He's had to lie down on a sofa because he doesn't feel very well. And then obviously we've got his dependency at the end and the idea that Jane is going to help him going forward in life. And his looks as well. Neither Jane nor Edward Rochester are conventionally good looking as you would expect in a romantic novel, both of the time period and now as well, really. So as with my other videos, we're going to go for the beginning, middle and end. Obviously, when I say the beginning regarding Edward Rochester, I mean his first appearance, because he's not right at the start of this text. So, beginning when we first see him, Adele says in chapter 7, Mr. Rochester lay down on a sofa. So that is what I was referring to about his seasickness. Before we've met this character, we can imagine him sort of lying down prone on a sofa. If you've ever felt seasick, I have before. It's not nice. There's nothing you can do about it. And that is what we're picturing. We're not picturing the Byronic hero at this point. I thought it was very interesting that Bronte chose to introduce him in this way. Mrs. Fairfax also tells us in chapter 11, his character is unimpeachable, so he's brilliant, but then she also says he is rather peculiar. So we've got that dichotomy put together before we meet him, this idea that, yeah, he's a great gentleman, but also he's a bit strange as well. Then when Jane first meets him, she says he had a dark face with stern features and a heavy brow. So we've got kind of the complexity, the darkness of his appearance. He's not typically handsome. But she also says that she wouldn't have been able to speak to him in the same way. This is when he's fallen from his horse. If he was a handsome youth. And I think that this is quite telling about Jane's character as well. She's only 18, 19 at this point, not very old. And she would have led an incredibly closeted life. This is something that Rochester refers to when he calls her a nun. Because obviously she was at Gateshead, she would have seen some of the male servants and John, her cousin, who obviously was an unpleasant character. She wouldn't have gone much further afield than that. And then obviously she goes to Lowood, and that's a school for girls, so she's only going to be mixing with girls there. All of the teachers are girls. Obviously there's Mr. Brocklehurst, but he's not someone she interacts with on a social level. Obviously he's very unpleasant as well. And obviously we've got a couple of male doctors, but you know how nowadays you will have been to the shop or, you know, obviously been to school, interacted with people of the other gender. She wouldn't have had that in the same way. So she is incredibly closeted. She isn't used to conversing with men at any real length. Rochester is her first experience of that, really. She says at one point, when she's looking out from the battlements, I longed for a power of vision which might overpass the limit. I know that's going to Jane and not Rochester, but it's again showing her confinement. She's looking at the horizon and wanting to see beyond that. Because she has been so trapped before, she just desires the world. Again, this is a quote Rochester says about Jane, but it links to that. He says, you have lived the life of a nun. So that is reinforcing how she has not met any men really, let alone a man like him, and in a situation like this. Then Jane says in chapter 13, he is very changeful and abrupt. So in that quote, we get the complexity of Rochester's character. He is unpredictable. He doesn't necessarily behave in the way that you might expect him to, or that Jane might expect him to. She doesn't know what's coming next. I think that's part of the reason that she loves him. He tells her in chapter 14, "Fortune has knocked me about." Now, we know he's deceitful in that he doesn't tell her about his wife. He doesn't elaborate any further at this point, but he is telling us, Bronte is telling us through this particular speech, that he's aware that his life has not been entirely lucky. It has been complex, and that has impacted him on him as a person. He does refer to himself as a commonplace sinner as well, also in chapter 14, which is telling Jane and us as a reader that he is not an entirely innocent man. He knows that he has sinned in his life. He has done things wrong. We don't know to what extent at this point. Jane says in chapter 15, there are excellent materials in him, somewhat spoiled and tangled. So this is again repeating this idea that he should be better than he is. He's got the innate qualities to be a great man, but something is holding him back from that. She doesn't know at this point, but she knows that there's something not quite right, something dark and complex within him. Probably, again, part of the attraction. If we look at the middle of the text, in chapter 18, Jane says, "I could not unlove him now." So she's under his spell already at this point. She loves him entirely, and she recognises that. She also says in chapter 22, "Wherever you are is my home, my only home." And this is particularly poignant because Jane Eyre is not somebody who has had a home in the way that many of us have or would hope to have, certainly not as a child. I mean, yes, later on in her years at Lowood, she was more comfortable there, but it still wasn't a home in the way that you would dream of or hope for. She sees her home as with him, and that is something that continues right to the end of the novel. She says in chapter 23, "If I had loved him less, I should have thought his accent and look of exultation savage." Now, she's referred to in places as savage, as is Bertha as well. But again, there's that savagery within Rochester, that wildness about him, about how he behaves, how he acts, what he does. If we move now to the end of the book, the butler at the inn, when she's returning to Thornfield, when she's felt that he's calling her in chapter 36, says he got dangerous after he lost her. So this is referring to Rochester after Jane left. The butler doesn't know at this point that he's talking to Jane Eyre. And it's showing us the level of hopelessness that Rochester felt after Jane had disappeared, because she felt that she couldn't stay. She felt it would be the wrong thing to do to be near him, and she didn't. Obviously, we know she didn't want to be his mistress, but it's showing how much he missed her, how that while she was destitute and helpless and hopeless, so was he to an extent. And then Jane says, "In his countenance I saw a change that looked desperate and brooding, that reminded me of some wronged and fettered wild beast or bird." So I've said in my other videos about all of the animalistic imagery that is applied to Jane Eyre, mainly by other characters talking about her, including Rochester. But here she's applying that sort of imagery to him too. This idea that he's a bird or an animal that has been treated badly and that is suffering and that needs help now, right at the end of the text. And then the final quote that follows on that theme that I've chosen is again one that Jane says in chapter 37. "It is time someone undertook to rehumanise you." And that is a challenge that she's wanting to accept herself. Whilst previously Rochester has spoken about Jane as if she's otherworldly, here it's like she knows that he's less than human now, that he's been damaged by her absence and obviously by the effects of the fire. He can no longer see fully. He's lost one of his hands as well. But she is taking on that challenge of ensuring that he recovers and that he becomes human again, because he is her human.